It was the year 3024, and the galaxy was in chaos. The war between the different alien races had been raging for decades. The once peaceful worlds were now torn apart by constant battles. Even the most advanced civilizations seemed powerless against the destructive force of their enemies. However, there was one race, a race of highly advanced beings known as the Galathians, who had sent out a distress signal for help. Desperate, they had called upon the most unexpected source, humanity. A human soldier named Mark Harris had been chosen for this important mission. He was known across the galaxy as a brave and smart fighter. Despite being young, Mark had already earned a reputation for outsmarting enemies far more powerful than himself. He was the kind of soldier who never backed down from a challenge, even if the odds were against him. Mark's orders were clear: travel to the Galathian homeworld, meet their leaders, and offer whatever help he could. But when he arrived at their central command station, he was taken aback by what he saw. The Galathians had a council of leaders, beings who towered over him in both size and intellect. They spoke in a language that sounded like music, and their eyes seemed to glow with ancient knowledge. But what caught Mark's attention the most was the strange woman they presented to him. The Galathians had chosen her. Mark was expecting someone powerful, someone capable of leading armies and shifting the tides of war. Instead, they handed him a small, fragile-looking alien woman. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were large and soft. She didn't look like a warrior at all. In fact, she seemed more like someone who would be easily broken by a strong gust of wind. "Her name is Naira," said one of the Galathian leaders, his voice deep and calm. "She may not appear strong, but she carries within her a unique power. We believe she will be of great help to you, Mark Harris." Mark was confused. "I was expecting someone stronger, someone who could help fight." The leader smiled. "You'll find that she holds a different kind of strength." Naira stepped forward, her steps quiet but graceful. She offered Mark a soft smile, though it was clear she was just as unsure of the situation as he was. Mark felt an odd mix of sympathy and frustration. He was a soldier, not a babysitter, and this mission was too important to fail. "I'm ready to help," Naira said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark didn't know what to say. He simply nodded, still trying to process what was happening. The other leaders gave him a look that made it clear this was not up for discussion. Naira was his charge now, and there was nothing he could do about it. As the days passed, Mark and Naira traveled together to various Galathian cities, meeting with different leaders and strategizing for the war. Mark's frustration with the mission grew. Naira was kind and intelligent, but she didn't seem to fit into the role he had expected. The alien woman often seemed lost in her own thoughts, gazing out at the stars with an almost distant look in her eyes, yet, despite her seeming fragility, there was something about her that intrigued Mark. He had expected someone who would be terrified or confused. But Naira was neither. She faced each challenge with quiet determination. She would offer insights and suggestions that often surprised him. She had a way of seeing solutions that Mark would never have considered. There was a softness about her, but also a depth he couldn't quite understand. One evening, as they were preparing for another briefing with the Galathian leaders, Mark sat with Naira on a balcony overlooking the planet. The stars twinkled in the distance, and the planet below was bathed in the soft light of its 2 moons. "I don't understand," Mark said after a long pause. "Why me? Why did they send me here with you? I fought in wars, but this doesn't feel like what I signed up for." Naira turned to him, her large eyes filled with understanding. "The galaxy is full of warriors like you, Mark. Strong, skilled fighters. But sometimes, it's not strength that changes the course of things. It's the ability to think beyond what we see, to find solutions no one else can. That doesn't make sense. We're fighting a war, not solving puzzles." Naira smiled softly. "You'll see. Sometimes the solution to a problem isn't a weapon. It's understanding the enemy, finding their weaknesses, seeing the big picture." Mark was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with new eyes, no longer seeing just a weak alien woman, but someone who might be more than he had first assumed. Over the next few weeks, Their relationship began to shift. Mark began to rely on Nira's ideas more and more. Insights were often right, her strategies clever and effective. It became clear that she wasn't just a burden, as Mark had initially thought. She had a purpose. She had something important to offer, even if it wasn't what he had expected. As the two of them continued their travels, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that there was something bigger at play. Something about Nira made him wonder if the galaxy's future was tied to her in ways he couldn't yet understand. And as they prepared for the first real battle against the enemies threatening the galaxy, Mark realized that perhaps he had underestimated her, but little did he know Nira was about to reveal a secret that would change everything. This marks the beginning of their journey. What starts as a mission full of doubt and confusion slowly transforms into an unexpected partnership that may hold the key to saving the galaxy.
All right.
Once seen as weak, begins to show her true strength. And Mark, the soldier who was sent to, help starts to see that the greatest power may come from the most unexpected places. Mark couldn't shake off the feeling that he was part of something much larger than himself. The days spent with Nira began to blur together, and he found himself thinking about her more often. She was no longer just the weak alien woman the Galathians had given him. She had become someone he admired. Mark had always prided himself on his ability to lead, to command. But Nira had a different kind of strength. It wasn't the kind that came from weapons or battles, but a quiet, unshakable strength that made people listen to her. It made Mark listen to her. As they traveled through different cities and met with various leaders, Mark started to see how valuable Nira was to their mission. Her mind was sharp, her ideas fresh, and her strategies unconventional, but effective. While other leaders relied on brute force and power, Nira had a way of understanding the enemy that Mark had never considered before. She would talk about patterns, about psychology, and about the way the galaxy's enemies thought. At first, Mark hadn't understood what she meant, but as time passed, he began to see the wisdom in her words. One afternoon, as they sat in the courtyard of a high-tech fortress, Mark couldn't help but ask her more about her people. He had learned that she was from a peaceful planet called Valoria, a world that had never known war until the current conflict threatened their existence. Nira's species, the Valorians, were known for their intelligence and their connection to the natural world. They were peaceful, not warriors, and their civilization had flourished for centuries without the need for military strength. "You never wanted to fight, did you?" Mark asked, his voice soft but curious. Nira smiled, but it was a sad smile. "No, we never wanted to fight. My people believed in peace. We believed that understanding and cooperation could solve any problem. But the galaxy changed, and we were forced to adapt." She looked at him then, her eyes filled with a kind of sadness Mark had never seen before. "Not everyone can be like you, Mark. Not everyone is born to fight." Mark thought about her words. He had always been a fighter, a soldier. That was his purpose. But Nira had a different kind of strength. She wasn't built for war, yet she was teaching him how to win battles without ever lifting a weapon. As the days passed, their bond grew stronger. They spent more time together, discussing tactics and strategies for the upcoming battle. Mark was beginning to see how much he had learned from Nira. Her intelligence, her insight into the enemy, was invaluable. She had a way of seeing the bigger picture, something Mark had always struggled with. He was focused on the immediate, the now, the fight in front of him. But Nira could see the future, the consequences of every action, every decision. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Mark and Nira sat on a balcony overlooking the city. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. It was a peaceful scene, a stark contrast to the war they were about to face. Mark took a deep breath, feeling the cool breeze against his skin. He glanced over at Nira, who was staring out at the horizon. Lost in thought. "You're different from the others," Mark said quietly, his voice almost lost in the wind. Nira turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "Different? How?" Mark thought for a moment. "You don't look at the war the same way everyone else does. It's not about strength or power for you. It's about something else. You see things that others don't." Nira was silent for a moment, and then she spoke, her voice low. Because I've had to. My people have always believed that understanding the world around you is the key to survival. War. War is just the result of misunderstandings of fear. I've seen it firsthand. The violence, the destruction, it's all so unnecessary. But sometimes, Mark, sometimes it's the only choice we have. Mark nodded, understanding what she meant. He had always seen war as a necessary evil, something that had to be fought, that had to be won. But Naira had a different perspective, one that made him question everything he had believed. Do you think we'll win? Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Naira looked at him, her expression serious. We'll win, Mark, but it won't be because of strength alone. It will be because we learn to work together, to understand each other. That's the key. Mark was quiet for a moment, thinking about what she had said. He had always believed that the strongest would win. But Naira was showing him a different way, a way that didn't rely on brute force or weapons. It relied on something much deeper. The next day, they were summoned to the Council of Galathian leaders. The war was intensifying, and the council was preparing for a major offensive. Mark and Naira sat side by side as the council members discussed their plans. The tension in the room was thick, and Mark could feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. Naira, however, seemed calm. She listened carefully, her eyes scanning the faces of the leaders, taking in every detail. Mark could sense that she was thinking ahead, considering all the possible outcomes. When the council finished discussing their strategy, Naira spoke up. Believe we are focusing too much on direct confrontation, she said, her voice clear and confident. Our enemies expect us to attack head-on. But if we do that, we're playing right into their hands. The room fell silent. The Galathian leaders looked at each other, surprised by Naira's boldness. Mark could see that some of them were skeptical, but he knew better than anyone how sharp her mind was. What do you propose? One of the leaders asked, clearly intrigued. Naira stood, her posture poised. We need to outsmart them. We need to create confusion, to strike where they least expect it. We can use their own strengths against them. Mark could see that the leaders were considering her words. This was the strategy they needed, the kind of thinking that would give them an edge in the coming battle. It was a strategy that didn't rely on sheer power, but on understanding the enemy's weaknesses and using them to their advantage. As the meeting ended, Mark found himself looking at Naira with newfound respect. She had a way of seeing the world that no one else could. She was teaching him not just how to fight, but how to think. How to win without destroying everything in the process. They may have started as an unlikely pair, but Mark was beginning to see that they were exactly what the galaxy needed. Together, they could do more than just survive. They could change the course of the war. Their bond had deepened over the weeks. And though the war was far from over, Mark knew that with Naira by his side, they had a chance. A chance not just to win, but to change the galaxy forever. As the days passed, the tension in the galaxy only grew stronger. The war seemed endless, with no clear end in sight. Mark and Naira had become an inseparable team, working together to form strategies, train soldiers, and gather support from different factions. Mark began to rely on Naira more than he ever expected. She was not just a guide or a strategist. She had become someone he could trust with his life. It was during one of their long journeys between systems, traveling in a sleek Galathian ship, that something unexpected happened. Naira, who had seemed so focused and strong, began to feel different. At first, Mark thought it was just the stress of the mission weighing on her. But as the days went by, it became clear that there was something more to it. One evening, as they sat together in the ship's lounge, Naira's face looked pale. Her eyes were tired, and she held her stomach in a way that made Mark's heart skip a beat. "Are you feeling all right?" Mark asked, his voice full of concern. And Naira smiled softly, but it was clear that something was bothering her. I think I'm fine, Mark. It's just something feels different." Mark studied her closely. Naira had always been a strong and composed woman, never showing signs of weakness. So to see her like this, it felt like something was off. He stood up and walked over to her, kneeling down in front of her. "Tell me, Naira, what is it? he asked gently. Naira's gaze shifted away, and for a long moment there was silence. The only sound was the hum of the ship's engines in the background. Then she looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "I'm pregnant, Mark," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air between them, and Mark froze. He couldn't believe it. 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. They had been so focused on the war, on survival, that neither of them had even considered the possibility of this happening. "Pregnant?" Mark repeated, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "But how? We've been through so much. The dangers of the war, the travels." "I know," Naira said, placing a hand on her stomach. "But my people, we have different biology. Our species can conceive under extreme circumstances. It's something we've never fully understood, but it's a gift or a curse, depending on how you look at it." Mark's mind spun as he processed her words. He had always known that species, the Valorians, had unique traits, but this was something he hadn't expected. He didn't know what to say. Had never been in a situation like this before, and the weight of it all felt overwhelming. "You're sure?" Mark asked, his voice filled with concern. Naira nodded. "I'm sure I can feel it. But there's something more unusual about this pregnancy. I think it's tied to something greater, something important." Mark sat down beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. He could sense the uncertainty in her voice, the fear and the wonder all at once. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about something much bigger. The child she was carrying, he wasn't sure why, but he felt like it would be more than just a normal child.
Oh.
There was power in Naira, a kind of strength he couldn't fully understand. The child. Could it be something special? Mark asked quietly. Naira's eyes met his, and for a moment there was a deep understanding between them. "Yes," she said softly. "I believe so. There are ancient prophecies about Valorian children. They say that when a Valorian woman finds the right partner, their children will be unlike any other. They will possess strength, intelligence, and power. The kind of power that could change the galaxy." Mark's heart raced. He had heard stories of ancient races, of children born with unimaginable abilities. But he never thought he would be involved in such a thing. And now, here he was, with a woman he had once considered weak, carrying a child who might hold the key to ending the war. The thought was both terrifying and thrilling. "Are you sure this is the right time for this?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The war, the battles." Naira looked at him, a calmness in her eyes. "I don't know, Mark. I don't know what the future holds. And I do know one thing. This child will change everything. We are part of something bigger than ourselves now." Mark took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. There was so much he didn't understand, but one thing was clear. Naira and the child she carried were important. They were the hope for a future the galaxy desperately needed, and he would protect them both, no matter the cost. As the days passed, Naira's pregnancy became more apparent. She wasn't showing much yet, but Mark could see the changes in her. There were moments when she would be lost in thought, staring at nothing, as if she were connected to something far beyond this world. He had seen this kind of focus before in people who were on the brink of greatness, and he couldn't help but wonder what kind of warriors this child would become. They continued to meet with the Galathian Council and strategize for the war. But Mark's mind was constantly pulled back to Naira. She wasn't just the mother of his child, she was becoming something more, symbol of hope for the future, a future that could see the end of the endless war. But as the days passed, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the universe had more planned for them than they could understand. He could sense the power growing within Naira, within the child. Something was changing, and it felt like the galaxy was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. One evening, as the stars stretched out before them, Mark took Naira's hand in his, and they stood together in silence. The war was far from over, but now, more than ever, Mark knew that they had a chance. A chance to end the suffering, to bring peace to the galaxy. The child growing inside Naira was the key. And no matter the obstacles, Mark was ready to fight for it. For them, for the future. And together they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. knowing that the child they were about to bring into the world would be a force unlike any other the galaxy had ever known. The days that followed Naira's revelation were filled with uncertainty and tension. Mark could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had been a soldier all his life, trained to fight, to survive. But now he was caught in something far more complicated. His role had changed, and he couldn't ignore the fact that Naira was carrying a child that could reshape the galaxy. The war had already taken a heavy toll on the galaxy. Star systems were falling, planets burned, and the future of countless species was hanging by a thread. Mark had always believed that strength and power were the only ways to survive. But Naira had shown him a different path, a path that didn't rely on weapons and destruction, but on understanding, strategy, and compassion. The child she carried would be the symbol of that new hope, a beacon for a future they could barely imagine. As Naira's pregnancy progressed, the changes within her became more apparent. Her connection to the child seemed to deepen, and Mark could feel it too. She would often spend long hours meditating, her eyes closed, as if she were communicating with something beyond their reach. Mark didn't understand it completely, but he could see that Naira was preparing for something big. One morning, as they traveled between planets, Naira suddenly went into labor. The ship's medical team quickly moved into action, but Mark could see the fear in their eyes. They'd never dealt with a pregnancy like this before. This wasn't just any child. It was a being born of two worlds, a fusion of human and Valorian blood, with unknown potential. "Naira, are you okay?" Mark asked, his voice filled with concern. He had been by her side through so much already, but this was different. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Naira nodded, though her face was pale with pain. I'm fine, Mark. This is just how it's supposed to be. The child will be born when the time is right." Mark stood by her side, his heart racing, didn't fully understand what she meant, but he trusted her. He had to. The ship's medical team worked swiftly, but it was clear that Naira's body was doing something extraordinary. As the hours passed, Mark felt a sense of awe and fear mixed together. He watched as Naira's strength shone through. Her determination to see this through was unmatched. Even in the midst of pain, she was calm, almost serene. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Naira let out a final cry, and the room fell into silence. The medical team rushed to her side, and Mark held his breath, waiting for the first sign of life. And then he heard it, a loud cry, echoing through the room. It was the cry of a child. Mark's heart soared as the baby was gently placed in Naira's arms. It was small, but Mark could see the power in its eyes. The child's skin was a mixture of Naira's pale Valorian complexion and Mark's human features. The child was perfect, beautiful, yet powerful in a way that was hard to describe. Naira smiled weakly, her eyes filled with tears. "Mark, this is the beginning?" Mark knelt beside her, his hand gently resting on the baby's tiny form. He didn't know what to say, but he felt a wave of love and protectiveness wash over him. This child wasn't just theirs. This child was the future of the galaxy, the future they had fought for. As the days passed, Mark and Naira began to understand the full extent of the child's abilities. The baby, a boy they named Kalen, began to grow at an extraordinary rate. Within weeks, he had the strength and intelligence of a child several years older. His abilities were beyond anything Mark had ever seen. His physical strength was incredible, but it was his mind that amazed them both. Even at such a young age, Kalen was able to understand complex concepts, and he quickly began to develop an understanding of the galaxy's political landscape. Mark and Naira were in awe of what their child had become, but they also knew that with such power came great responsibility. The galaxy was not ready for Kalen, and neither were they. Had to protect him, to nurture him, to help him understand the power he wielded. As Kalen grew, Mark found himself looking at Naira in a new light. She had always been the quiet, intelligent strategist, the woman who could see things no one else could. But now, with their child's incredible potential unfolding before them, Mark saw that Naira was more than just a survivor. She was the mother of the future. She was the one who had carried the hope of the galaxy, But not everyone was happy about Kellen's birth. News of the child's abilities spread quickly, and soon, other factions in the galaxy began to take notice. Some feared the child's power, while others sought to control it. The Galathian Council, once supportive of Mark and Naira's mission, began to question whether the child's potential would be a threat to their rule. "Mark, we need to be careful," Naira said one evening as they discussed their plans. "The galaxy is not ready for Kalen. Some will see him as a weapon, others as a savior. We need to protect him." Mark nodded. He had seen the fear and jealousy in the eyes of the galaxy's leaders. He knew that they would do anything to control Kalen if they could. But he also knew that he and Naira had something that no one else had: each other and the strength of their bond. "We will protect him." "Ah, Naira," Mark said, his voice filled with determination. "We will do whatever it takes to keep him safe." As Kalen continued to grow, Mark and Naira trained him, teaching him not only how to fight, but how to think, how to lead, and how to understand the responsibility that came with his power. They knew that one day he would have to face the enemies of the galaxy, but they also knew that he would be ready. The child born of two worlds would become the key to ending the war and bringing peace to a galaxy torn apart by years of violence. The birth of Kalen marked the beginning of something extraordinary. It wasn't just the birth of a child, it was the birth of a new hope, a new future. The warriors of the future had arrived, and the galaxy would never be the same as the days went on. Mark and Naira realized that they weren't just preparing for battle, they were preparing for something far greater. They were preparing for the future of their child and the future of the galaxy. The power they had unleashed with Kellen's birth would change everything. The galaxy was on the edge of a new era, and Mark, Naira, and their son would lead the way. As the weeks passed, the galaxy began to change. The birth of Kalen was not just the arrival of a child, but the start of something far more significant. Mark and Naira knew that their son was destined for greatness, but they didn't yet know how great. The child, born of both human and Valorian blood, was rapidly developing abilities beyond anything Mark could have imagined. His strength, intelligence, and quick learning were unparalleled, and he had begun to show signs of something even more extraordinary. It wasn't just Kalen anymore. The child's presence seemed to have awakened something in Naira. She had always been strong, but now with the child growing inside her, she was becoming something else, something more powerful. She was connecting with him in ways that Mark couldn't fully understand. It was as if the bond between mother and child was creating a new energy, an energy that filled their home and their hearts. Soon, Kellen's abilities became more than just a surprise. He could communicate through thoughts, his intelligence surpassing even the most advanced minds of the galaxy. He would ask questions that made the smartest leaders pause, and his insights into the war were sharp and insightful. It was clear that he was growing faster than anyone expected, and he wasn't just learning from his parents. He was learning from the universe itself. One evening, as Mark and Naira sat together, Kalan came into the room, his face serious for such a young child. He walked up to them and spoke, his voice deep for his age. "Father, Mother, the war will not end unless we change the way we fight. The enemy's strength lies in their fear and their power. But their weakness is in their belief that they are invincible." Mark and Naira exchanged a glance. They had never expected to hear such wisdom from their son, especially not at such a young age. But here he was, speaking with the kind of clarity that only the most experienced generals could possess. "What do you mean, Kalen?" Naira asked gently. "Their strength is based on their belief that no one can challenge them," Kalen continued. "But if we show them that we can defeat their power without force, they will be afraid. Fear is their greatest enemy. They fear the unknown, the things they cannot control. And that is where we can win." Mark sat in silence for a moment, considering his son's words. He had always relied on the power of weapons and soldiers in battle, but Kellen's insight was different. It wasn't about brute force. It was about outsmarting the enemy. It's breaking their confidence and making them doubt their superiority. "Your mind is sharp," Kalan Mark said, his voice full of admiration. "You're right. We've been fighting with strength, but it's time to fight with strategy." Naira nodded, a proud smile on her face. "We must teach the galaxy to think differently, to see the enemy not as a force to overpower, but as a challenge to outwit." Over the next few weeks, Mark, Naira, and Kalen worked together to create a plan. It wasn't about attacking the enemy head-on. Instead, they would create confusion, disrupt communication, and spread misinformation. They would make the enemy doubt their strength, make them question their power. It was a strategy that had never been used before. They knew it could change the course of the war. Meanwhile, Kellen's abilities continued to grow. His strength was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. He could lift objects far heavier than what should have been possible for someone his size. And his mind was capable of solving complex problems in the blink of an eye. Mark and Naira watched in awe as their son became not just a child, but a force of nature. But with power came responsibility. Mark couldn't ignore the fact that their son was not just a symbol of hope, but also a target. The galaxy's enemies were watching, waiting for a chance to strike. Mark knew that it wasn't just about winning the war, it was about protecting his family. He couldn't let Kellen's power fall into the wrong hands. "We have to be careful," Mark said one evening as they sat in their home discussing their next steps. "There are factions out there that will try to control Kalen. They'll see him as a weapon, and they'll stop at nothing to use him." Naira's expression was serious, but there was also a quiet confidence in her eyes. "We've raised him well, Mark. He knows his purpose, and he knows what it means to have power. We'll protect him, and we'll fight for his future." Mark nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. But he also knew that they were not alone in this fight. The galaxy was full of people who were ready for change, ready to follow a new path. They had already begun to see the power in Kalen and the hope he represented. And that hope was spreading. As the war raged on, Mark, Naira, and Kalen began to gather support from other systems. The new strategy they had created was slowly taking effect. The enemy, once so confident in their strength, began to falter. The galaxy's factions, once divided, started to come together under the banner of a new vision. It wasn't about fighting with weapons. It was about fighting with intelligence, unity, and the courage to challenge the status quo. Kellen's influence was undeniable. His presence in battlefields was enough to turn the tide. Soldiers who once felt hopeless now fought with renewed energy, inspired by the child who was both a warrior and a symbol of what the galaxy could be. And as Kalen grew, so did his abilities. He was becoming the leader they had all been waiting for, the one who could unite the galaxy and end the war. But Mark knew that the final battle was coming. The enemy was not going to give up easily, and they would not allow their control to slip away without a fight. The galaxy's future rested on Kellen's shoulders, and Mark and Naira knew they had to prepare him for the challenges ahead. One day, as Kalen stood before them, his eyes filled with determination, Mark placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Are you ready, Kalen?" Mark asked. Kalen nodded. "I've always been ready, Father. It's time to end this." With that, they knew the final battle was about to begin. Kalen, the child who had been born in the most unlikely of circumstances, was now the hope of the galaxy. The warriors of the future had arrived, and the galaxy would never be the same. The war had dragged on for years, with countless battles fought and millions of lives lost. But now, the tides of the conflict had begun to shift. Mark, Naira, and Kalen had become a symbol of hope, not just for humanity or the Valorians, but for every species across the galaxy. They had fought not with weapons, but with strategy, intelligence, and unity. And as Kellen's powers continued to grow, the final battle that would decide the fate of the galaxy was fast approaching. Kalen stood at the front of the army, his young face set in a serious expression. Though he was still a child in many ways, his presence on the battlefield was enough to send shivers through their enemies. The enemy forces, once so confident in their strength, were now filled with doubt. They had underestimated the power of this child, the child who had been born of two worlds and carried with him the hope of the galaxy. The enemy fleet had gathered in orbit above the largest planet in the galaxy, a world that had been devastated by years of war enemy believed that their show of force would be enough to crush the last resistance. But what they didn't know was that Mark, Naira, and Kalen had been preparing for this moment for months. The strategy was in place, and they were ready to strike. Mark looked at his son, who stood beside him, his eyes scanning the horizon. Naira, too, was by his side, her calm presence reassuring him. They had come so far, and now the final test awaited them. "Are you ready, Kalen?" Mark asked, his voice steady but filled with the weight of what was about to happen. Kalen nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "I am. I've learned everything I need to know. The time has come to end this." Mark placed a hand on his son's shoulder. He had watched Kalen grow from a child into something much greater, a leader, a warrior, and a symbol of hope for the galaxy. It had been an incredible journey, but now it was time for Kalen to step into his true role. The final battle was not going to be won with brute force. The enemy believed that they were invincible, that their power would be enough to crush everything in their path. But Kellen's strength, combined with the wisdom of his parents, would turn the tables. It wasn't just about strength. It was about outsmarting the enemy, breaking their confidence, and showing them that they could be defeated. "Let's move," Kalen said, his voice calm but firm. The fleet of ships, consisting of united forces from all corners of the galaxy, began to move forward. Kellen's strategy was simple. They would divide the enemy forces, causing confusion and panic while also targeting their weakest points. The key was to make the enemy believe that they were losing, to create doubt in their minds as they neared. The enemy fleet, Kalen activated the first phase of their plan. He sent out a series of false signals, creating the illusion that the human and Valorian forces had turned on each other. The enemy, caught off guard by the sudden confusion, hesitated. This was exactly what Kalen had hoped for. Now phase 2, Kalen commanded the fleet split into smaller groups, moving quickly and quietly, attacking the enemy from multiple directions. The enemy's ships scrambled to respond, their communications disjointed and confused. The once feared war machines that had caused so much destruction now seemed disorganized, vulnerable. The galaxy's united forces, inspired by Kellen's leadership, pushed forward with renewed strength. The enemy fleet, already shaken by the chaos, began to crumble under the pressure. Mark and Naira watched from their command ship, their hearts swelling with pride as they saw Kellen's plan unfold, but the enemy's leaders were not willing to give up so easily. In the midst of the battle, a massive warship, far larger than anything they had encountered before, appeared from behind the enemy fleet. What was the last weapon in the enemy's arsenal, a ship designed to destroy everything in its path. Leaders of the enemy had hoped to use it as their final blow. To crush the galaxy's resistance once and for all, Mark's heart sank as he watched the massive warship approach. It was unlike anything they had ever faced. The ship was heavily armored, with weapons capable of wiping out entire fleets with a single shot. It was the ultimate weapon, their final, desperate attempt to win the war. But Kalen was not afraid. He had known this moment would come, and he had prepared for it. "Phase 3, Kalen said, his voice filled with calm certainty. Mark and Naira exchanged a look, understanding what their son had in mind. Kalen had learned everything from them, but he had also developed his own strategies, his own ways of thinking. This was his moment to shine, to show the galaxy what he was capable of. As the massive warship loomed closer, Kalen took control of the battle from his ship, used his unique abilities to tap into the enemy ship's systems, overriding their controls with ease. The warship, once a symbol of the enemy's power, was now under Kellen's control. With a single command, he turned the ship's weapons against its own fleet. The massive warship fired on the enemy's forces, its weapons now targeting their own ships. The destruction was swift and complete. The enemy fleet, once so powerful and confident, was reduced to nothing in a matter of minutes. The galaxy's forces watched in awe as the tides of the war turned in their favor. But Kalen was not done yet. He activated the final phase of his plan, one that would bring an end to the war once and for all. Using his advanced intellect and abilities, he sent out a powerful signal, broadcasting a message across the galaxy. "Enough," Kalen said, his voice echoing across the stars. "The time for fighting is over. We are not enemies. We are one galaxy, and it is time to rebuild." The message was simple, yet powerful. It struck at the heart of the galaxy's inhabitants. The fighting had gone on for too long, and it was time to put an end to it. Kellen's voice was a symbol of the change that was sweeping across the galaxy, a new era of peace, cooperation, and unity. The enemy's leaders, now broken and defeated, had no choice but to surrender. They realized that they could not win not against Kalen, not against the unity of the galaxy's forces. The war was over. Mark, Naira, and Kalen stood together on the command ship, watching as the galaxy began to heal. The battle was won, not by strength or weapons, but by intelligence, strategy, and the power of hope. Kalen had led them to victory, not with his power alone, but with his wisdom and understanding of what the galaxy truly needed. "Are you proud of him?" Naira asked, her voice filled with awe. Mark nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "I've never been prouder. He's not just our son, he's the hope of the galaxy." As the stars began to shine brightly once more, the galaxy knew that it had entered a new Erewhon of peace, unity, and hope. And at the heart of it all stood Kalen, the warrior who had changed everything. The future was bright, and the galaxy had been saved.